What's happening, guys? What's going on at YouTube? You guys have tuned into Rules for Rebels, and in today's video we're going to be talking about Joe Rogan's $100 million deal with Spotify to bring his podcast off of YouTube and bring it over to Spotify exclusively. Joe Rogan is obviously the most popular podcast right now, the most listened to podcast, and has been for a while. So that's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. I think the title of today's video is going to be something along the lines of my reaction or my thoughts on Joe Rogan bringing his podcast to Spotify. So those of you guys who watch this channel, subscribe to this channel. I had posted something about this on the community tab the other day. I was kind of curious to hear your guys' opinions, and a number of you guys had chimed in. Before we get into this, are you guys fans of podcasts? Do you guys listen to podcasts? And if so, what podcast do you listen to? Go ahead, drop them down. Let me know if you guys have any suggestions for me. I'm a huge podcast fan. There's really only a handful of podcasts that I follow and listen to, on a regular basis, or that I'm really loyal to. And I do most of my podcast listening or watching on YouTube. So there's a lot of interesting podcasts that I stumble upon and I enjoy, but I don't necessarily watch on a regular basis. As far as some of the ones that I watch on a regular basis, Joe Rogan would be one of them. Dave Ramsey is another one. Matthew Cox's True Crime Podcast, amazing podcast, awesome podcast. And I actually discovered him through the Concrete Podcast, which you absolutely got to check out, the Concrete one. Matthew Cox, his is called True Crime or True Crime Daily or something like that. If you Google him, you can find him. But basically, he's a guy, he was featured on an episode of American Greed. He went to prison for 10 years for mortgage fraud. And while he was in prison, he would write other prisoners' stories. And he was in prison with some fascinating guys, some really interesting stories. And it's kind of his true crime stories are kind of different than your average true crime story, because he's not just an author who went and interviewed somebody. He was actually living with these guys and really kind of got to get in depth and kind of get their life stories or their crime stories. But his own story is very fascinating. He's written about a lot of fascinating stories. My favorite one is the one about Frank Abadeo, who you guys may have heard his name. He was kind of a big guy in politics, and he was almost like a real life evil genius or evil villain who was planning on taking over the world. Really fascinating story. That was an interesting one. But Matthew Cox's True Crime Podcast is basically a narrator reading his true crime stories. And those are really good, but Matthew Cox, man, he's got such a great kind of personality, he's such a great storyteller, and he's a funny guy, that I actually prefer watching these stories on the Concrete Podcast, and he's become a regular guest on the Concrete Podcast, so I'd highly recommend checking that out as well. For those of you guys not familiar with Concrete, it's a YouTube channel. There's some rich real estate developer down in Tampa, really kind of eccentric, kind of outspoken guy. I can't think of his name. But the podcast kind of started off with him, and then this guy Danny, who runs the Concrete Podcast, also makes these mini documentaries. One series is called Doc Hands. Really kind of interesting stuff. But definitely check out the Concrete Podcast, Matthew Cox's True Crime Podcast. Like I said, some other ones I listen to: Joe Rogan, Dave Ramsey, and I used to like Serial. Serial was a really good podcast. The first 2 seasons, I think they've maybe done 3 or 4 all in all. I wasn't too crazy about the last couple, but whenever me and my girlfriend are on road trips, we always try to find a good true crime podcast. Those are some of my favorites. Like I said, I mainly listen to my podcasts on YouTube. Oh, Simon Rex has a decent podcast too. I mainly listen to my podcasts on YouTube, and I think I do have a podcast app. It's called Podcast Addict. And I think maybe Dave Ramsey, Serial, and maybe a couple other true crime ones that aren't on YouTube are the only ones that I listen to on that. Otherwise, I prefer to listen to podcasts on YouTube. Now, I guess I've rambled for 4 minutes. We haven't even gotten into Joe Rogan's. When I initially heard about this, my reaction was like, fuck, I don't want to have to download Spotify. I don't have Spotify on my phone. I really don't like downloading unnecessary apps. I like that everything is on one place on YouTube. So when I heard about this, I was like, fuck, man, I don't really have to want to download another app to watch Joe Rogan. And I was also I kind of even though a lot of times I just listen to Joe Rogan in the background, or when I'm on a run, I'll have it in my pocket and I don't get the video aspect. I like that Joe Rogan does have a video aspect, and man, what's his name? what's Joe Rogan's sidekick? Oh, Jamie. Jamie, pull up this video. Jamie, pull up this picture. I kind of like that there's a video component to it. You got to see Elon Musk smoke a joint on that one episode. Like, I kind of like that. And initially I was like, well, Spotify doesn't have video, so that kind of sucks that it's going to video. Well, apparently Spotify is going to have a video component specifically for Joe Rogan. Not sure if that's going to roll out to other podcasters as well, but it kind of got me thinking, like, I wonder if Spotify is going to turn into like a video app. But yeah, just initial thoughts. When I first heard about this, I was like, good for Joe Rogan. He got $100 million. I'm like, I hope he hasn't sold out. I hope the podcast isn't going to get watered down. And then just kind of for selfish reasons, I was like, I don't really want to download another fucking app. But after thinking about it a little bit more, it is pretty cool. Valuetainment, Patrick Bet-David, who runs Valuetainment, actually did like a reaction video to this the other day, and he made some interesting points. He said, they gave Joe Rogan $100 million, which is a ton of money and a lot of money for a content creator. But he said, well, what does this deal look like for Spotify? And Spotify's stock price went up like, $18 or $28 after this announcement. And so if you look at the market cap of Spotify stock, like Spotify made, I forget the exact number, it was somewhere between $2 billion and $5 billion after this announcement. So pretty good deal for Spotify, right? You spend $100 million, you give $100 million to Joe Rogan, and you wind up making $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion, $5 billion, whatever it is. So smart move on their part. I also thought it was a smart move, and Patrick Bet-David actually kind of commented on this as well. Spotify didn't go after the number 3 podcaster, the number 5 podcaster. They went after Joe Rogan, the most popular, most listened to podcaster out there. And there's probably some people who won't follow Joe over to Spotify, but the Joe Rogan believers, the people who are really loyal to Joe Rogan's show, will definitely follow him over there. I'm sure Joe Rogan will probably pick up some new listeners over there as well. And supposedly this is just kind of like a distribution agreement. Like, they're not going to own his show. They're not going to take, this is at least what we're being told. They're not going to take over creative control of the show. That was kind of written into the contract, that Joe can continue to talk about whatever he wants to talk about. He's not really going to be, censored or reined in at all. So yeah, I mean, I guess, after kind of thinking about it, seems, Joe Rogan made a shitload of money, good for him. Seems like it was kind of a good deal for Spotify. And Patrick Bet-David actually made another good point, which was, Joe Rogan has kind of elevated the game, or shown the true potential value out there for content creators. And I'm guessing, I'm sure PewDiePie makes a lot of money. I know that Ninja guy, who was a YouTube streamer and then went over to Twitch, he's done really well. But what's kind of cool about this for people like you and me, content creators, people who make content, people who make videos, maybe some of you guys have a podcast out there, it's kind of elevated the game and showed, okay, not everybody's going to make what Joe Rogan does, but if Joe Rogan can make $100 million, it kind of shows that there's value out there for podcasters and content creators, which is kind of cool. And then also, I think competition is always good, and hopefully it kind of makes YouTube step up their game. You would think that Joe Rogan, either himself or his agent, would have contacted YouTube and said, look, guys, I got an offer from Spotify. They're offering me $100 million. Do you want to either match that $100 million to keep me here? Do you want to stop, being weasels about the, about like demonetizing content and things like that, and stop being, stop censoring things, stop demonetizing things, and actually let me, make my money on here. I think it's been reported that Joe Rogan, through the podcast, through ad deals and YouTube ad revenue and everything else, makes about $30 million a year. I think on like some episodes he might make, a couple hundred million, like the initial Elon Musk episode. Or Elon Musk, Elon, is that his name? I'm having a brain fart. Anyhow, Joe Rogan makes a good amount of money, but this Spotify deal kind of brings things to a whole new level. So yeah, it's kind of cool that YouTube maybe has some competition. I'll be curious to see, like, if Spotify rolls out this video feature to all podcasts, and then also, like, is Spotify going to try to make a play against YouTube and be a competing video platform? I think that'll be interesting to see. So I guess that's kind of all my kind of thoughts on this. I'd be curious to hear from you guys. What do you guys think just overall about the Joe Rogan podcast moving over to Spotify? For those of you guys who listen to Joe Rogan, will you follow him over to Spotify? Just any other thoughts that you guys have? even though I'm kind of annoyed about it, I probably will download Spotify and follow them over there. Just a few other details. Even though I think Spotify is a paid app, I don't use it. I don't really know how it works. I think of it more as a music app, though I do know that, Anchor.fm and a lot of these other platforms do, post videos to Spotify as well. But I guess the podcast will continue being free. Supposedly they won't censor Joe Rogan. I think this begins sometime around September, if I'm not mistaken. By the end of the year, by the end of 2021, I believe all the old episodes are going to be taken off of YouTube and I assume moved over to Spotify. And then just one other deal from what I hear. If any of you guys I know a lot of people say, look, man, I don't got the time to listen to a fucking 4-hour Joe Rogan podcast, but I do like listening to, JRE clips, or when they got those 7 or 10 minute clips of the Joe Rogan podcast on YouTube, and it'll be on a very focused thing. Elon Musk talks about coronavirus, and it's a 7-minute clip, so you don't have to watch a whole 4-hour podcast. You can watch a 7 or 11-minute clip and kind of get different parts. And so from what I hear, these JRE clips will still remain on YouTube. So for those of you guys who just like the Joe Rogan podcast in small doses, you should still be able to get that. But that's my ramble for today. Would be curious to hear what you guys think, so go ahead and drop a comment down below. If you are not subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button down below, and if you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.